Hey everybody, I am Prototype Raptor, and today I'm going to be walking you through my track Democracy Made Manifest. This is a Helldivers 2 inspired track that I started when the game came out, and of course, through rewrites and mixing and detail work, all that stuff, it's now, significantly later than I would have liked to have put it out, but that is how it goes sometimes, so I appreciate your patience. This is a 2010 style electro house tune. I've been really kind of feeling that throwback sound that I was doing back at the time. So if you like that, there's a lot more in the works whenever I get that done. So yeah, let's start with the breakdown. Right off the bat, there is this little Easter egg. Starting the track with a gunshot is a reference to Knife Party's Rage Valley, which is one of my favorite tracks of theirs. And given, Helldivers' ridiculousness, guns and democracy and freedom and all of that, I thought, what better time to reference that than this track? So there is your Easter egg. The structure of the track itself is your standard, intro, verse, build, drop, repeat. The only thing I'm doing differently these days is shortening the intros and outros, just either 8 bars or 16 bars. That's just for streaming. They really want you getting to the chorus or whatever the catchy bit is, really quickly. So some people skip their intros. Some people skip intros and the verse. You start off in the build or start off on the chorus itself and then do the rest of the track. So it's kind of the Wild West out there. You do whatever you want. I'm going to go down the list. I'm going to start with the drums because that's generally the first thing that I do in a track. So the drums on this track are pretty simple. I wanted to keep it in that 2010s sort of vibe where they're really chunky percussive drums. I am a MIDI guy. I'll use audio clips for like auxiliary percussion or fills or like reverse effects, things like that. But the main tracks I like to keep MIDI because what you can do is make an instrument rack out of like simpler, and then you can very quickly audition different samples. You drag them in. You don't have to do things like hot swapping the audio files or like duplicating everything and then redoing everything. So there's probably a faster way to do it. I'm no Ableton expert, but this works for me. You can do stuff like this, for example. So it just makes it really easy to test out different vibes. Drum processing, I generally go about it the same way in all of my tracks. I'm usually looking for maximum clarity and punch. That's just because I like a loud, clean master, and so I'm trying to minimize as much distortion when it goes to mastering as I can. And the way you do that is by building it cleanly from the track up. So, for example, with kicks, what I'm doing here, so you have rolling off the sub part of the kick. So you have the transient, the body, and then I'm rolling where the actual tail would be, and that just makes room for the sub and the basses so they don't quite, conflict as much. Then I'll do some sort of transient designing. This one, I'm using the DBX 160 down here, and that is a very powerful compressor for like generating an attack. So you could also use any number of compressors. You just want a higher attack and a shorter release. And the longer the attack, the bigger that transient will be. You also could do something like use this stab. I'm using that down here on the snare. This is a cool little plugin that I think was designed more for like processing breaks because it has 4 bands and each band has a ton of gain for the transient itself in that frequency band, but it also kind of has a gate on it the more you push it. So it's really useful for like stereo kits, things like that. You can use it. It will not only increase the attacks of things, but it will add a very natural sounding like clamp on some of those frequencies. So like the snare, if I bypass it, you got that like low range fluff. I use this acoustic audio quite a bit. I really like this Salt EQ. I believe the gold mode is emulating a SSL console, which I will definitely never be able to afford. So sometimes I like adding console strip, like channel strip plugins, just run them on every channel just to pretend like I have a real analog console. I don't think it really matters, especially in dance music. I don't think anyone can tell that you do stupid things like that, but it's can be fun. It's fun. We're here to have fun, right? Another thing I like doing is using something like RBass, which is a subharmonic generator. That basically helps the sub frequencies translate to smaller speakers. So if I bypass this, you just get the natural sub. Again, it's a subtle thing, and you may or may not even like the way that affects the sound. But since lots of people listen on earbuds or, like less than ideal sound systems, it's something that I like to keep in mind. The next thing that I'll do after I EQ, clean up the samples itself, and then do whatever enhancement or channel strips or any of that compression, I'll check the phase. So in this one, I'm using this M-Auto line, which I usually don't use. It's a little bit fancy, but I thought I'd just try it out this time. Phase is important, especially if you are having your snare and your kick ever like play on the same beat. Again, we're trying to keep it as loud and as controlled as possible. So when you start running into phase cancellations, it gets nasty fast. So if I turn this off, you'll see what I kind of hear. It gets a little bit more hollow. So it's not that big a deal, but once you start clipping stuff and limiting it, and then you do that again in the master and then the buses, it adds up over time. So you have to think in the smallest things you do at the track level will get blown up later. It's just like using a microphone, right? If you're using it like I am here in this little studio setup, it's not that big a deal if I, have a plosive or something like that pops. But if you do that in a giant arena with like 50,000 people, everyone will hear this highly amplified pop. When you're making those changes at the track level, you just have to be thinking, later on, what is this going to do to my sound? The bus itself, there's just a whole bunch of little enhancements going on. But the main thing is, again, is clipping at the end of the day. I've got a saturator and this puff mix pass plugin, which is really funny, but it is a kind of like a wave shaper. So that's both, wave shaping and in clipping and compressing. And I also have the fab filter checking peaks at the end of it. So more and more these days, I also recommend doing any sort of clipping or saturating or limiting in stages. So like do one after the other, or do one, then do a little bit more processing, then do another, then do a little bit more processing. Just because, again, you're trying to keep it transparent as much as you can. And that's how you get that cleaner volume at the end of the day. So the same with the auxiliary percussion. I do the exact same thing. Like I'm using a gate to clean up a little bit of the fluff. I'm using a little clipping action, phase checking, a little bit of a ducking to the kick itself, which I'll get more into with synths and basses later. And then for the ride cymbal, I'm using this little fun trick by putting a vocoder on it. So what the vocoder does is it kind of, not only does it soften it, but it also kind of emulates how a drummer would hit at the different parts of the cymbal every time. So you can also do that by, say, taking an EQ and automating like the bands, right? But ain't nobody got time for that. So I just use the vocoder, and you can automate the format a little bit if you want. That's just a good way you can try to fake having round robin samples. Essentially, if you don't have like a contact library or something, because it makes a big difference when you are comparing that to that. A lot of the times I like using little loops. I used a lot of, Vengeance loops back in the day. There's still some even here. They're just there to kind of like window dress. If you turn the ducker off too, you hear all the transients that sneak in. Again, that's just extra little bits that will cause distortion when you start clipping later on down the line. So just as something to keep in mind. I don't always duck the auxiliary bus, but in a loud song like this, I Now let's talk about the synths and the basses. So for this track, I wanted to go back to the 2010s, like kind of what I was doing back then. And the way that you do that in Ableton now is with a lot of resampling, as well as just duplicating tracks and then making slight edits to the same patch. So you'll see here's like the main drop. If I solo just the basses, here's what we're working with. So you see there's kind of a main sub patch, which most of these I built in Current, which is a really fun synthesizer by Minimal Audio that has a ton of nice little effect options. Definitely recommend checking this thing out. It's really fun. And the wavetables are also neat, but a lot of the time I'm just using the sub oscillator just as it is because it's got all sorts of cool stuff here. So the first thing I do is I write the actual melody. So I come up with a sort of thing that I can then hawk it out, which is an old school like Gregorian chant compositional technique, but one I've been doing for a very long time now. So what I'll do is I'll write like the riff, the piano riff, and then I will take that and then split it up amongst a bunch of parts and then piece that all together as best as I can in a cool sounding way. So I think about it in terms of frequency ranges a lot of the time. So I've got, synthesizers at the top end and the middle end. And if I want like a signature bass sound, I'll have to fill out the rest of the frequency spectrum with something else or cut away from that extra stuff to give more room to that synthesizer or bass in that moment. So like right here, I knew I wanted to have like a bugs sound effect, like again, kind of referencing Knife Party Centipede. I really liked the way that was very clearly supposed to be just this bug coming for you. So I knew at this moment that had to kind of be on its own. So the fewer things that are going on around an instrument, the louder and more obvious that instrument can be. So it's kind of, again, like a spectrum. You're giving and taking. So my thought process generally when I'm making synths is to take the bass layer and then figure out some way to add a cool texture to it, then blow that texture up with some sort of compression, usually, again, the multiband stuff. So like, for example, in this one, I'm just using this little crappy Nexus sound. But I'm using Rift and compressing it, getting all of that done. And so after I run it through the texturizer, so that's the initial sound. And that's the sound after you use the multiband compression to bring up the artifacts. And that's why I end up resampling a lot, because those artifacts can get out of control really fast, and you don't want like tails and things to keep carrying over into the rest of your cuts. Because again, like the drums, we're trying to keep it really clean. So you'll notice again in like Skrillex's projects, some of those like Noisia templates, things like that, they have lots of bounced audio because you can fade out tails. So you got to do it. I mean, in Ableton, you have to do it manually, which kind of sucks, but it helps. There's a big difference, right? If you just kept that open. It doesn't quite have that same punch to it. It's a little bit sloppy. Doing your manual fades, rendering stuff like that is important when you're working in this sort of style, and it does take a little bit longer than you would hope. So I'll do the same thing with basses. I will take the initial patch, and then I will add some filters or some sort of texturizer, then use plugins to blow that sort of extra layer up. So let's take this patch right here. This is the first bass hit. So I have the current patch, and then like a rift and some compression and a filter, and then even more compression. So here it is just by itself. Here's kind of missing some of that mid-range. What we're trying to do is make the mid-range interesting on a lot of these patches. I really like that sort of neuro sound. So a lot of that comes from crazy frequency bands interacting with each other. So you can use like a phaser or just to like actually automate EQ notches yourself manually. But I'm using just some little LFO synced filters and then this Argent compressor, which is a really cool plugin. It's kind of like an OTT. It's got a multiband mode, and it is way more aggressive than OTT. It is like 100 minus 100 dB. This thing will take whatever you feed it and like blow it into just a solid brick. So it's really fun for sound design. So again, here's your initial, and here's after the filters. You get a little bit more interest. So that's what I'm always trying to do. I'm trying to make my sounds not quite so static, which I think is one of the secrets, if you will, to having a good like Complextro or Electro House with all the cuts. Making it sound slightly more live makes it better when you are jumping between things so fast. If it's just it kind of doesn't work. It doesn't flow as well, no matter how much you compress it or EQ it or do any of the further down processing. A lot of that comes from the initial track level, and then you blow it up later. The other thing is the sidechaining. We talked a little bit about that in the auxiliary percussion bus, but right here, I generally am doing my sidechaining on the group level. I'm not doing it on the individual track level. And I'm doing it before any sort of filtering, like final DJ style effects filtering. And I also am again using the MIDI triggers. And I will, in fact, change the ADSR of the curves depending on what is being sidechained. So I will do less sidechaining for synthesizers sometimes, like the mids and highs, and I will do more sidechaining on subgroups, things that really need to be open. And that's, again, that kind of just a judgment call based on what you are, currently mixing. So if it's like an 808 and a really low kick, you might have to scoop a lot of that out. But yeah, generally you do slightly less the further up in the frequency spectrum you go. That's how I think about it. The second drop, again, is more of the same. I just added some leads. And again, I wrote a lot of the initial stuff. Right, and usually the initial composition itself is very simple. So the more you're going to do to a track, the more you want the actual like sheet music underlying that to be simple, I've found. So if you're trying to get really fancy with your chords, you probably want to back off on having like 100 sounds playing that chord in 2 seconds. But if you're doing some really basic chord progressions with some like pretty simple stuff, you can get away with making the textures more interesting. You'll see here, I do the same sort of trick as I do with the snares and the kicks sometimes. I'll make an instrument rack out of a single MIDI thing, and then you can process each one differently or have different patches on that same MIDI thing. So it's like making an old school MIDI stack, like you would with the sound font player or something. As far as the synth like leads and stuff, I will play those out either on keyboard and then do them if I am not very good at it, or I will just play it and then comp it together, because Ableton is a really cool comp tool. You can see like I had several takes of this where I played through and I liked certain bits here and I didn't like certain bits here, so then I just pieced that together into the final bit. And I do feel like a feature of Complextro or some of this type of music is having the synthesizers being a little bit inhuman. So I honestly kind of like that vibe, because a real synth player, even someone who's like way better than me, would not be able to play it quite as on beat as like, for example, this riff. Like no one, I mean, probably someone can, but like most synthesizer players, that would be like a little bit sloppier, right? And of course, you got to have the lick in there too. Okay, let's talk about the orchestral and choral components of this track. I was really going for a early Hans Zimmer vibe, so think like Pirates 1 or The Rock, and really kind of over the top, very string and brass heavy, and kind of synthetic, a little bit fake sounding. So in order to do that, to fake the choir, I recorded a whole bunch of tracks using an old like pop technique. So I would record, really close and play sides, just trying to get like different timbres, and then you also sing in different ways. So you try to vary up your vocal as much as you can, and it'll sound a little silly. So you do stuff, like sing up here or sing back here or ah. So you're just trying to emulate what other people would sound like, essentially, and then you can, pitch shift that, format shift that in the box additionally. And then I took it one step further and I ran some of those through an AI plugin that changes the vocal completely. And then I fed those all back together, summed them up, and then put them through a big hall reverb. And that's how you're getting this sort of fake choir sound. As far as the orchestral stuff goes, I'm using contact patches as well as a bunch of these East-West Hollywood orchestrator patches, which I really like using. They're kind of like a quick and dirty way to fill out a soundscape without having to orchestrate the full orchestra yourself. Essentially what it does is it'll take a chord or whatever you feed it and then split it up amongst the parts as if you have an arranger like helping you out. You can do stuff like so the second section of orchestral stuff doesn't have the choir in it, and mainly because it was way too much of a pain to do twice. And I really, again, going for that Hans Zimmer early vibe. So the strings are enhanced with quite a bit of distortion and high end, and they're not programmed in a way that is natural sounding. So you'll see like a lot of these attacks are exactly the same, perfectly quantized, and it's giving me that sort of synthetic vibe that I'm going for. far as composition goes, again, I'm just thinking, early Hans Zimmer, big open chords, moving around the circle of thirds, keeping it really cinematic and military. And you'll hear here again, I'm using the Opus stuff to fill out the background. Another thing when you're doing orchestral stuff like this, there's always this little sub enhancing it. This is just your basic Ableton sub. If I were to mute it really does lose a lot of power. So whenever you're writing purely orchestral stuff, doubling the bass parts with a actual synthetic sub is super common. Something that I like doing that Ableton makes really easy is track delays. So I'm essentially pushing all of the Contact and Opus stuff to the left in the arrangement window. So that way they're lining up better. So a lot of times orchestral libraries, they'll be keeping the attacks of all of the instruments. So it sounds more natural. But the downside to that is when you hit the button, it doesn't actually go. So you have to either go in manually and move stuff back so it kind of triggers when you actually want it to trigger, or you can kind of feel it out, scoot it back as you like using the track delays. So I'll do that quite a bit. The only thing you want to watch out for, which I didn't have to run into this track as a problem, but when you do that, Ableton kind of messes with the MIDI trigger if you're using sidechaining. Sometimes it's okay. I don't necessarily know what causes it, maybe certain plugins, but sometimes when you do that delay, the track then is off with sidechaining. So something to watch out for if you do that, during a drop or sometime where you need the sidechaining to be tight. This is the full completed track, and this is something I like doing in all of my stuff. I've done this for, 15 years at this point. I will start writing on the track, and then I'll do like sketches at the start. So when you first start, I like going as quickly as possible. So presets, loops, you can always go back and change that stuff. But when you're actually writing the thing, I feel like you really want to stay in that flow state and go as fast as possible so you have the next section pop up or you have the next idea come. So to keep that going, I do little sketch pads. And what I will do is when I'm done with that and I go back the next day or whenever the next session is, I decide, maybe I didn't quite like that as much. I will just copy it and I will throw it over further down the timeline and just have it at the end of the track so I can always, go back and see what I was thinking about and maybe turn that into another track or maybe decide it works in a certain section later on in the actual song and then fly it back in. So you'll see over here, after the real song is over, there's all this initial, sketch stuff from the start. So you've got like a different drop idea where I was thinking about maybe slowing it down, but I decided I didn't really like it as much. Right. Then you've also got maybe some extra, I think there's... And there's also the the very first drop, like when I first started trying to piece it together, is over here. But yeah, I like keeping that stuff. Just it's fun to go back to sometimes and listen to, but it's also sometimes you're like, wait a second, I had that right a couple days ago and now I'm overthinking it. For the last section, I will talk about the effects and overall DJ style filters on the master. I used to use a lot more effects than I do now, like white noise and risers and cymbals and things like that. Now, I would rather fill in the spectrum with, basses and auxiliary percussion and synthesizers. But I still use some things to increase tension at, various sections. So usually like at the end of a 4-bar or 8-bar loop, like right here. Just stuff that keeps it flowing. But nothing super fancy when it comes to that. You're just trying to fill out the spectrum if there is no additional stuff going on. Another thing that I like to do is a stereo bus type of processing. So for this track, I'm using Endless Smile, which is a neat little plugin. And what I'm using it for is essentially automating it like you would at a DJ mixer level. So over the entire track, turn the knob, and then you filter the whole thing. Reverb, or you stutter, or whatever you want to do. You have to be careful with that because it's on the entire mix. But for example, it adds a lot to this build here. If I turn that off, it just doesn't quite have the same rise to it. And you can get really creative with this. I know lots of other producers have all kinds of cool tricks and racks and things that they use, but I really am not a big fan of making risers and builds myself. It's just one of the most boring things that I think you can do. So I'll just do what I need to do to get the effect across and then move on to the fun stuff. So there you have it. That is the Prototype Raptor vibe, I guess you could say. Like I said, I've been into that 2010s sound again. So you can expect more tracks like this and some of my older material coming out, sooner rather than later, hopefully. If this video, goes over well, people like it, I'll do more walkthroughs, maybe do some more deep dives, that sort of thing. But in the meantime, thank you very much for all your support and listening and watching, and I will see you on the next video. Bye, everybody.